I was asked to talk to you about a question that we always ask ourselves. Who really built the pyramids? Was it our ancestors, as we sort of learn when we're little kids and we sit at the Seder table and we see those Haggadah with pictures of the pyramids, and we know that our forefathers were slaves in Egypt and they worked very hard and they built. So I have to start at the beginning and tell you this is wrong. Our forefathers did not build the pyramids. They were built much before Israelites ever existed. And we won't go into the question whether the Exodus really happened and the Israelites actually lived in Egypt. But what we do know from the Bible is that the Israelites built two cities called Pithom and Ramses, which we know and recognize. And we also know that they worked with mud bricks, with clay and mud and straw. The pyramids were built out of stone. So we'll put this away at the beginning of the lecture. I mean, our forefathers did not build the pyramids, even though when Begin met Sadat, he said, we share the pyramids, and it was very embarrassing because it's not really true. So who were the pyramid builders, and why were they built, and how were they built? This is a question that's been bothering scholars and scientists and New Age people forever. Before we start, we have to know a few things about Egyptian way of life or Egyptian culture. So first of all, Egypt is a huge land. It's a very big country nowadays. It was a very, very big country in ancient times, but it's mostly desert. 95% of its area is desert, and then the only inhabited part is along the banks of the Nile, and it's a very, very long Nile in Egyptian territory, over 1,000 kilometers, that goes from the south, from Aswan nowadays, up to the Mediterranean Sea. And you can see this satellite photo on the screen right now. Now, there's some basic concepts of Egyptian culture that we have to understand. And I don't know if you had a previous lecture about it or not, but I'll repeat it anyhow. First of all, this huge country, as contrary to other countries or other states in the ancient times, was one big country. It had to be unified from the north and to the south as one kingdom. When it was unified as one kingdom, it was very, very strong. And the power to do this, to unify Egypt and to keep it unified, was the main task of the king, which was extremely powerful in Egypt, and he was what we call the pharaoh. Pharaoh, of course, is not a name, it's a nickname. It means really big house, big house. It's like when we say, the White House is very angry with Balfour, and we know that we're talking about Trump and Bibi. So the pharaoh was really a nickname called the big house. Usually we don't know, in the Bible at least, we don't know who the actual pharaohs that we are told about were. So this was one concept, the unification of Egypt, which was important, the extreme power of the king, and another concept which was extremely, extremely important in understanding Egyptian life was the belief in life after death. The Egyptians believed that death was just one stop on a long way of life that started with the living part. And then after dying, you went on actually living in a different way forever and ever to eternity. And they believed that not only the soul survived after death, which is a belief shared by many other cultures and religions, but actually the body was also kept sort of alive, which is the reason for mummification, to keep the body also alive. So these two concepts, mostly the power of the king and the deep belief in life after death, which eventually led to the building of the pyramids. And when we talk about the building of the pyramids, we talk about a period which is called in Egyptian history the Old Kingdom, which was like from the 27th century BC, which nearly 5,000 years ago, till about 2160 BC, when this was the first period that Egypt was unified under one king and had dynasties that followed one another. The first two dynasties were the beginning of the concept of kingship of this huge country. But when we get to what we call the Old Kingdom, we actually get to a period which was ruled by a dynasty that we call the Third Dynasty. And all this is recorded in Egyptian history. So one of the kings of the Third Dynasty, whose name was Djoser, lived in the capital of Egypt, which was on the eastern side of the Nile, a capital that in Greek was later called Memphis. In Hebrew, we call it Moth. And when he started ruling, he also started preparing for his death by building an amazing complex that would be used for his burial. And actually, his afterlife place, his tomb, his grave, was not just a hole in the ground and where you keep the body forever, but actually an imitation of the palace and the city he had in his real life, because this concept of life after death really means that you want to go on doing what you were doing in life after death. So he was building, and we're talking about 27 centuries BC, about nearly 5,000 years ago, and he started building this complex, and he surrounded it by a wall. And for the first time in Egypt, he built a wall which was built out of stones and not out of bricks, which was a great, great innovation at the time. So there was this huge wall which surrounded a very large area. We'll see it later. And you went through one opening because it was a place that nobody was supposed to visit after, except the priests later on. So there was only one entrance. And when you entered, you went through a passage, through a colonnade of columns. And these were the first built columns out of stone that in the world. And the columns actually imitated papyrus columns, because the original building materials in the north of Egypt were papyrus reeds, which were tied together to make strong columns. So this is the entrance, and you go through it, and of course it's restored, but it maintains the original shape. And once you go through this passage, you get into a huge courtyard. At the end of it, there's the first pyramid. And the first pyramid is actually a step pyramid, because up to that time, the kings of the first and second dynasty were buried in graves that had on top a kind of a building which had one floor. It's called mastaba. You can imagine if you look at this sort of first floor. But Djoser had an architect whose name is Imhotep, who later on was deified because he was considered such a genius. And Imhotep probably thought that this one-story kind of building is not good enough for his powerful king. So after he built this first building, the first floor, he added another floor. And then he added another one, and another one, and another one. And eventually he got a pyramid, which is stepped. It had 6 steps. And you can see this, and the interesting part is that you can see this trial and error method, because once he started putting the top steps, he realized that the base was too narrow, so he widened the steps. So you can see that this is the original, and then it gets wider at the bottom. The higher it goes, the wider the base has to be. Eventually, it gets to this stone pyramid, and the tomb itself was down a very long shaft. That's where the tomb was. So the tomb was dug down, very deep down, and the step pyramid went on top. Now, the interesting thing, again, is that the step pyramid is built out of very small stones that were actually the size of bricks. So, because this was really this big innovation of building in stone and imitating in stone the regular method of building with bricks. Eventually, the height of the pyramid was about 70 meters. It's a bit lower now, but it was huge and very, very impressive. But the pyramid is the grave. This is the tomb. This is where the king is buried. But it's not the only thing that's inside. Remember this big wall that surrounded it? Inside, before we go to there, inside the burial chamber, he decorated it with kind of tiles that look very much like our bathroom tiles, but they're not made out of ceramics. They're made out of a special material that the Egyptians invented, which is called faience, and it's colored in turquoise or blue, and it's very, very beautiful. You can't go in, but this is from the museum that represents this tomb, and this is the burial chamber. Of course, when it was discovered by modern scientists, everything was dropped. There was nothing, hardly anything inside. If you want to know what this Djoser looks like, this is his statue, very small one, which shows actually all the attributes of a king, because all future Egyptian kings will have this false beard and this head covering, and the position of sitting on a throne in a very upright kind of a position. This would be the model for future kings. We'll see it later on. So this was our friend Djoser, who built himself this complex. Remember the wall? We went through from here. This is the entrance, this is the wall, this is the colonnade, and this is this huge courtyard. Now the courtyard is very important because it was made in order to celebrate the jubilee of the king. Egyptian kings used to celebrate the jubilee if they reached 30 years of ruling. So 30 years is a long time because usually, the life expectancy wasn't very high. So to reach 30 years of rule was very important. And there was this big celebration, which was called, we call it the Jubilee, but it was called Chebsed in Egyptian. And what the king had to do during this celebration was to wear a short skirt, hold an oar, a boat oar in his hand, and run across from one side of this courtyard to the other. This is the size of a football field, and back. Imagine if all our politicians were standing for re-election would have to run back and forth up on a football field. That would be very funny. Anyhow, he used to do that, and then in the middle there were stands for the statues of the gods, and he had to get the reaffirmation of the gods for his continuing rule. So there was this very big court, and then there were two buildings which we don't exactly understand their function, but one was called the Building of the North, and one was called the Building of the South, which probably meant the unification of Egypt. And then there was a street of buildings which were really temples. Here is the picture of the king running. It's a very bad one because that's what survived. So, but you can see him running, and he must have been at least 40, 50 years old when he was doing that. And there's this street of buildings, and the two different shapes of buildings. You can see that the different roofs, and they were representing the temples of the gods of the north and the south. But the funny thing about it is that when you look at them, you see that these are the restored facades, which are very beautiful, very nicely built. But if you look in the back, there's nothing there, which actually means that this was like a decoration. These were not real temples. These were virtual facades, because the Egyptians, even though they spent so much effort and expense in building for their afterlife, they realized that it wasn't real. So why waste too much money? or there was no money at the time, but why waste too much effort? So it's not, you don't have to build whole temples. You build the facades of the temples. This is virtual reality. I mean, this wasn't invented in the 21st century. This was invented by the Egyptians, that you don't have to do it really. It can be virtual. So this was, here we can see it closer. We can see the symbols of strength, of power. These are the decoration on the walls. Are decorations that mean this is a hieroglyph that means the power of the king. This is the cobra, which represents a goddess of the north, that her duty was to look after the king. So we see a lot of symbolism in the building, which would be repeated later on till the end of Egyptian culture. So when Djoser died, and he had this huge step pyramid, and he showed everybody how big and how important he was. And then his descendants, or his followers, who founded the fourth dynasty, actually had a very hard task to do even better, because if Djoser could build such a step pyramid, then his predecessor, the king who came after him, whose name was Seneferu, would be better. So Seneferu started building a huge pyramid, which was very, very, very tall. And somehow, halfway through the building, before it was finished, the whole thing collapsed. Again, it's evidence for the trial and error method. So what this pile of sand that you see under the pyramid, at the bottom of the pyramid, is actually the collapse of material of the top of the pyramid. This is the original, what was supposed to be the original plan. It had to be stepped, very, very tall, very, very sharp angle, and it didn't work. So we don't know how many people were killed in this trial and error method, but Seneferu didn't give up. He said, this doesn't work, we'll build another pyramid. So he went to a different place, a little bit further south, called Dahshur. Here's again the Meidum pyramid. And he started building another pyramid. And the builders must have realized halfway through that, again, the angle of the pyramid is too steep. So if it would go on the same way, it would be, again, very, very, very tall and probably would collapse. So halfway through, they closed it, they changed the angle, and the result was a bent pyramid. This is the way it's called. It's called a bent pyramid. You see that it's sort of bent in the middle. So Seneferu wasn't satisfied. So he built himself another pyramid, the third one. Can you imagine during his lifetime, putting all this effort? Can you imagine this? To finally get what he wanted, what we call a true pyramid, which has a square base and the angle is quite just right. So he built himself a true pyramid, which is called the red pyramid because it's covered with red stones. And after all this effort, King Seneferu died. And then his son, called Khufu, said, well, if my father built 3 pyramids, I'm going to build one which would be the greatest pyramid on earth, which of course is what he did. And here we see again, from Saqqara, from Djoser, Seneferu, and we get to his descendants who built their pyramids in Giza. Now, Giza nowadays is a city which is sort of a twin city to Cairo. It looks like part of Cairo, but it's an independent city, and the pyramids are in the middle of the city. When he built them, the capital of Egypt was on the other side of the Nile because people lived on the eastern side of the Nile. And when they died and they buried their dead, if they could, in the West, because they imagined that life was like the way the sun went from east to west, and dying was like sunset. For instance, the word in Egyptian for Zichrono Livracha, for Zal, is not blessed be his memory, but the Western. So-and-so, the Western, which means so-and-so who's dead. He went to the West. So on the west bank of the Nile, in the desert, and that's very important. And this is why tombs in Egypt were kept and survived till today, because they were built in the desert. So they were, first of all, the desert sand and heat and dryness keeps everything in good shape. And also nobody moved them. If they built in the agricultural area, nothing remained. The fact is that we hardly find houses or palaces. In Egypt, we find mostly tombs and graves because they were built in the desert. So here we get the big three kings of the fourth dynasty. The first one was called in Egyptian Khufu. Maybe you know him by the name of Cheops, which is his Greek name. But the first one was Khufu, and he built his great pyramid, and then his son Khafra built the second one, and his grandson Menkaure built another one. And like in the Three Bears story, there was the big one and the middle one and the little one. This picture is really, it's from a very strange angle. So actually this one is the biggest pyramid. This is the second one, and this is the smallest one. So let's talk about this whole complex. So this graveyard, really, this burial ground is called the Giza Pyramid Complex. Has quite a few parts in it. It has these three big pyramids, which exist till today. They have little pyramids. Some of the two of them have little pyramids that were used for the wives and children and family relations. There were also a necropolis, a city of the dead, because the nobles, when they died, wanted to be buried next to the king, because if they lived near his court in life, they wanted to be near him in death. So they built their own graves near him, and we see actually the graves built like streets. It's what we call in Greek necropolis, the city of the dead. And the pyramids had other parts. You remember, it's a complex. It's not just the grave. There's some other necessities for the burial of a king. Here we can see this is computer imaging of the three pyramids, Khufu, Khafra, and Menkaure. They're all built in the same area. They're all on the same elevation, on a plateau, which is called the Giza Plateau. And here you can see, again, the Great Pyramid with the subsidiary ones, the necropolis, but you can see other parts as well. There is this building here, which is a temple, and there is a causeway for the funeral procession, and there's another temple. This is called the Valley Temple. We'll see it in a minute. And this is the mortuary temple. There were two temples next to the pyramid. We can see this as well with the little pyramid too. So let's look at this pyramid complex. As I said, it includes different parts. The pyramid, the mortuary temple, this is the one that's next to the pyramid, and that's where the mummy is given its last rites and preparation for burial. There's the Valley Temple, which was used for mummification only. And there's the ceremonial causeway that was built and was used for the procession. And as we saw, the subsidiary pyramids, the nobility mastabas, the nobility graves. And there's another thing which we'll see later, a workers' village. So if we look at the Great Pyramid, which is one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and actually the only one that exists nowadays, and it really is amazing to think that it was built 4,500 years ago. That's unbelievable. So just to give you a few numbers, it has 2,300,000 stone blocks of different sizes, weighing, the smallest ones weigh 2 tons, the biggest 15 tons. Actually, if you weigh all the stones together, you'll get to 6.5 million tons of stone. And just imagine quarrying it and moving it. The base area is 230 square meters, and the height is 146 meters. Now, the top 10 meters are the top of the pyramid is missing. Now, the big question, of course, is how did they build it? Well, and we'll get to it in a few minutes. But if we consider Khufu the king who built this huge pyramid, reigned for 23 years. And we know that on the day the king started reigning, the first thing he did was to proclaim that he's going to start to build his afterlife palace or afterlife home. And if he ruled long enough, then he managed to finish it. Some of the kings of Egypt never managed to finish their pyramids or their graves because they didn't live long enough. But if you think that he had 23 years to build this huge pyramid, it means that every year they had to quarry and carve and transfer and lift 1 million stone blocks, 285 per day, and each one weighing an average of 2.5 tons. I said somewhere more, somewhere less. We'll talk about how they did it, or what we think about how they did it a little bit later. So this is how and if you look at the pyramid now, you see that it looks like it has steps, but actually it was covered by limestone stones that were very smooth and very white and very bright, and they were stolen. They were stolen much later, mostly during the Mamluk period in Egypt in the 10th century AD.
I'm sorry to interrupt. This is Bella. A few people are sending messages that they can't see the screen. So the person who opened the meeting...
Bella, this is disturbing me, though. If you want to send the message, send the message, but you have to mute your loudspeaker.
Yeah, but we can't see the pyramid, Galia. It's gone. The screen is off. You have to put it back on.
Okay, can I go on?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, so as I said, there was an outer casing of the pyramid which made it very white, and mostly during the Mamluk period, which was in the 10th century AD, the citizens of Egypt, of Cairo, just stripped the pyramid of its covering stones to build their own buildings and mosques. So if you see a Mamluk mosque in Cairo today, you can imagine that some of its stones came from the pyramid. It was the easiest way to quarry well-dressed stones before. So the entrance to the pyramid was, of course, hidden. This is the original entrance, but as you see, it was covered with stone. This was exposed in the 10th century AD, but when people went into it, they realized at that time, which was 1,000 years ago, they realized by then that everything that was probably stored inside, all the gifts and all the equipment that the king would need for his afterlife was stolen and robbed probably in ancient times already. So nothing was left in the pyramid itself. Now, the pyramid itself, and we'll talk about it also a little bit later, has a very long passageway inside it that leads, and very steep, it's very, very steep, it's very narrow, and this would lead to the burial chamber. And the burial chamber was right in the middle of the pyramid. Now, again, this pyramid has inside a lot of passages and the rooms that we don't know what they were used for. Whether they were, one of them, for instance, is called the Queen's Chamber, but nobody else was buried there. So we don't really know what all these passages and rooms were meant to be. Maybe, again, it was a question of trial and error as they were going along. For instance, in the burial chamber, which is right, where is my thing, which is right here, in the burial chamber, the only thing that you can see nowadays is this big stone coffin that the king used to lay there. But the stone coffin is wider than the passage, which means that actually the stone coffin had to be laid there before the pyramid was finished. They also had a system apparently to protect this passage so that the thieves wouldn't be able to get into the burial chamber, which probably held all those treasures. they had a system of what they call the portcullis, where they would drop huge blocks of stone on anybody who tried to get in. But obviously the robbers managed to get in. But there's a lot of mystery, and we'll see it a bit later too. Now, this was the big pyramid, great King Khufu, and we know very little about him. We know there are lots of legends about him that say that he was a very wicked and bad king, because obviously people imagine that if you build such a pyramid, you had to be a very bad person, a very wicked king to achieve such an achievement. Anyhow, his son, Khafra, built a pyramid which is slightly smaller than his father's. It's only 143 meters high, but he has two great things that were remained. First of all, the outer casing, these white stones that were covered the top of the pyramid, still remained at the top. Everything down was robbed, but this still remained. And of course, he had the Sphinx, which was in front of his pyramid. And if you look at the Sphinx, you realize that the Sphinx is a statue, apparently having the King Khafra's face, maybe we don't know. It's actually, the Sphinx is a hybrid kind of animal. It has a lion's body and a man's face. But the interesting thing is that the Sphinx is carved from the local sedimentary rock, which is very, very soft. And the Sphinx nowadays has a lot of problems because it suffers from very high degree of erosion, mostly because of the bad pollution, air pollution in Cairo. And there's an international effort to try and save the Sphinx from disintegrating. But an interesting thing, between the legs of the Sphinx, the lion legs of the Sphinx, there's a stone stele. Stele is a big piece of stone which is carved. It's a memorial kind of stela. This is it. And this was put there by a king who ruled Egypt 1,000 years after Khafra. His name was Thutmose IV, and he came to visit the burial ground of the ancient kings in Giza. And he was horrified to see that the whole place was very neglected and the tombs were in bad shape and the Sphinx was miserable. And he went to sleep near the legs of the Sphinx. And then he says, that's what's written on this stela, that he had a dream. And in his dream, the Sphinx talked to him and told him, King Thutmose, you'd better take care of your ancestors' burial ground and restore it and bring it to good shape and so on. And this is what Thutmose did. If you want, this is the first public restoration of an archaeological site in the 15th century BC. So this is the dream of the Sphinx. But it's not enough. We are in Khafra, the second pyramid, second biggest. It has the Sphinx. It also has this huge built causeway which survived. It was supposed to have a roof, but the roof didn't survive. But you can see that this is very well planned and built nicely. And this causeway leads from what we call the Valley Temple to the pyramid itself, to the mortuary temple. Now, the Valley Temple was built probably next to a canal which led from the Nile, because the king's coffin had to be brought from his palace on the other side of the Nile, on the Nile, by a canal to the burial ground. And then it was brought into this Valley Temple. Now, the temple is amazing because it survived, and it's built out of granite, huge blocks of granite. Now, granite was quarried and transported from Aswan, which is 1,000 kilometers upriver, and during a time where the strongest material they had to work with was bronze, and bronze is not a very strong metal, or harder stones, stones harder than granite, which are also difficult to find. So this is really an amazing feat of quarrying and transportation from Aswan to the Giza area. And this building, which they put so much effort into, was actually used only for about 70 days. It was used for the mummification process, for the process of mummifying the body, drying it up actually and stuffing it so that it would survive for eternal life. So this was very, very important. The mummification usually took 70 days, sometimes longer, because we very often have dates of when the person died and when he was actually buried. And this varies between 70 and 140 days. Actually, we know that our forefather Jacob was also mummified, and his mummy was brought to this country. So this is the Valley Temple. But that's not enough. There were some more things that each pyramid must have had. One of them was a burial ground or graves for boats. Now, you know that they had to use boat to transfer the coffin from one side to another. And next to Khufu, next to the big pyramid, they found a grave for a boat, which was dug or excavated into the rock and covered with huge blocks, which really closed it very tight. And when it was discovered, they found that inside there was a whole boat separated into pieces of wood that actually made up, when they were restored, made up a whole boat. They even found the original ropes that were used to tie the different parts of the boat. And when it was found, it was an amazing discovery. It was discovered in the 50s of the previous century. And they set a restorer who was an expert at his job, who sat for about 5 years trying to figure out how to fit all those pieces together and restore and rebuild the boat in its original shape. And then the Egyptian government built a whole museum to put the boat in, because it was so big. This is the huge boat. It's about 50 meters long. It's made out of cedar wood, cedar of Lebanon. It has wooden nails and ropes, no metal at all. It has these extremely long oars, and then it has this cabin on the top. We don't know for whom. And on the other side, there's this little hut where the steering person would stand and steer the boat. Now, the big question is, what was this boat used for? Why? And we know now that we found quite a lot of boat graves. And now they found another boat, and they're not digging it out because they don't know what to do with it, because they don't know how to preserve it. So they're keeping it in its grave. That's the safest place. But what was the boat used for? So originally, of course, the idea was that this was the boat that took the king's coffin from his palace to Giza. But once they checked the wood, they saw that the wood never was in water. I mean, it was never in the river. It never got wet. So this is, again, not a real boat, but a virtual boat. What was it used for? So apparently, it was a symbolic boat that was used actually for the ceremony, or for the belief that the king, when he dies, follows in the footsteps of the sun. And the sun, which is the most important feature in Egyptian life, you know, there's no rain and there are no storms, but there's sun. And there are quite a few sun gods. And the sun would travel in a boat in the morning from the east to the west, like the king who'd come from the east and die in the west. So this is a symbolic, again, virtual. It's a real boat, but it would never, if you put it in water, it would drown immediately. And it's a symbolic boat for the way of the sun from one side of the sky to the other. And this was part of the burial ceremony. It was very necessary. So this was Khufu, and then we have a little pyramid. Now, by the time the grandson of the great pyramid builder lived, he must have run out of funds, because his pyramid was much, much, much smaller than the other one, the previous ones. It was only 65 meters high. It had its outer casing was made out of red granite, which was very, very beautiful. But Menkaure really had a very small pyramid. And we'll talk about these funds a little bit later, why he ran out of them. Now, what did these kings look like? So we don't have much written, even though there's a lot of Egyptian writing, there isn't much writing from this period of the Old Kingdom, and there are no documents really that tell us much about the building of the pyramids. A little bit, we'll talk about it later. What did these kings look like? So Khufu, which was this tremendous king who could build this great pyramid, the only statues that survived of him is a tiny little statue, which is less than 10 centimeters high. You can see it on the screen. It looks big, but it's a tiny, tiny little statue. This is the king as opposed to his huge pyramid. His descendant, King Khafra, left us a lot of statues in his valley temple mostly. And these were really, this is the beginning of king statues that we know in Egypt. They would all follow the same shape. The king would always look very athletic, very strong, very young looking. We don't know how old he is. His face would be very handsome and very, sometimes smiling, but serious, looking like he's really the ruler of the world. And he had this skirt and a kerchief on his head and the false beard. And Egyptian kings would look exactly like this till the end of Egyptian kingdom. At the bottom of his throne, they start this, there's this symbol which means the unification of the two lands, which is the main power of the king. So this is King Khafra, and King Mykerinus, King Menkaure, who had this tiny, small pyramid, left us some of the most beautiful statues of himself with goddesses that he admired. So there's the goddess, probably Isis, who sort of holds him, and look at the way her hands kind of, she embraces him. Again, he's very handsome, he's young, he's very sporty. At that time, one of the titles of the king that would accompany the kings from now on is that the king actually is the son of the sun god Ra. Now, these two symbols, you see the circle is the symbol of the sun god, the sun. And that's the sun god was called Ra. And the duck is really a hieroglyph of the word Sa, which means sun. So the king was called the son of the sun god Ra, which means actually the king is deified. The king has the power of a king, of a god, like, because he's the son of God. And the most important God, the God of the sun. Now, when we get to the 5th dynasty, a little bit later, we see that the power of the king, or at least the financial power of the kings, is diminishing because they're still building pyramids, but the pyramids are much, much smaller, very badly built, so they were preserved very, very badly. This is a pyramid of a king called Unas. We have his causeway, we don't have his temples, but there's one big difference in the pyramids from the 5th dynasty on. Inside, while the previous pyramids had absolutely nothing inside, no inscriptions, no decorations, nothing, here we find texts written all over the walls, very beautiful, in very beautiful hieroglyphs. And these are called the pyramid texts. And the pyramid texts are really kind of magic incantations that are supposed to help the king find his way to the safety of the other world, of eternal life. So let's now see, so how do they build a pyramid? So of course, you know, maybe people, you know, all the stories that people from outer space really arrived and built it because human beings couldn't have put up such buildings 5,000 years ago. And if you follow the actual work, what had to be done in order to build the pyramid. So first of all, they had to level the area. The plateau, which we saw before, which is quite level, was hilly, was full of rocks, and it was a hill. So they had to level it off, and they have to have it quite flat. So how they achieve this flat, level area? They made canals, very shallow canals, and they put water through them. And if the water, they saw how the water flowed, and then they would know whether it was level or not. So they leveled the area. And of course, they were using the rock that they were quarrying to level the area to build the pyramids. They didn't bring the rocks, the stones from far away. After they leveled the area, they had to place the pyramid, and it wasn't haphazardly done. They aligned the pyramid according to astronomical data. The pyramids are facing exactly to the true north. And you have to ask yourselves, 5,000 years ago, how did they know to find the true north and align the pyramids exactly? And that's one of the reasons that people think that it has an astronomical kind of meaning. Anyhow, then they had to quarry the stones, mostly local, as I said, from the area itself, mostly local. So they saved the effort of transporting the stones. But for the outer casing, which was white and used different kind of limestone, they went to the other side of the Nile, to what is now central Cairo. And there's a hill there called Tura Hill, and that's where they quarried the stone for the pyramid. And there's a lot of geological research nowadays that is showing exactly where the stones come from in this Giza plateau. And then they had to quarry the granite, which they did in Aswan, which was far away. And then they had to start raising the stones. So how did they do it? The most common idea or explanation is that they built earthen ramps made out of mud bricks and sand, which had a very comfortable, if I can say that, angle. And then they used to wet the sand with water, some people say with oil, to reduce the friction. And then they would put the big stones on a sledge, and a lot of people very slowly would carry it up, and the ramp used to go round and round and round the pyramid till it got to the top. Now there's a theory by a French engineer that said that it wasn't done from outside, but it was started from the inside. I wouldn't go into all this detail, but still the ability to do such a huge project without all the technical equipment that we know today is really amazing. Now we're getting to the main question of this talk. Who actually built the pyramids? As you remember, it's not our forefathers, and I don't think it was people from outer space. So we have a tomb of a nobleman who was a priest, and priests were also had administrative tasks. And inside his grave, this guy whose name was Kai says like this: I paid them with beer and bread. I told them to swear that they are satisfied. The words of Kai, a priest and a judge, of the builders and the craftsmen who built this tomb. So here we have evidence from a nobleman, a priest and a judge who lived at the time. He lived during the 4th dynasty, and he said, my task was to pay the workers and the craftsmen, and the payment, of course, there was no money at the time. The payment was beer and bread. This is your payment. Enough beer and enough bread to feed people. And they also had to say that they were satisfied, which is amazing. And nowadays, we don't always do that. So we know that there were workers, we know that they were paid. Now, by whom and how? A few years ago, two researchers, one of them is an Austrian guy called American Mark Lehner, and the other one is Egyptian Zahi Hawass, found the workers' village or the workers' city where the people who built the pyramids actually lived. And this is the plan of this area, of this city. And we now know that if you know Egyptian geography, then you know that the Nile floods Egypt for 3 months every year. At the end of July every year, the level of the Nile, as a result of the monsoons in Africa and so on, the level of the Nile rises, and then it floods the whole of Egypt. At the time, it was dangerous, but it was also a blessing because it irrigated the fields and it brought a lot of sediments that made the land of Egypt very, very fertile. But during this inundation period, where the fields were flooded, people couldn't work in the fields and they had to be fed. The king's task was to look after them. So the way the king helped his citizens was by providing them with work, which wasn't very nice maybe, but it was work. And if they worked, they were given beer and bread. So they were fed and their families were fed. So this was a good deal for both sides. The king had a huge workforce that could work for him during inundation period, and the people had what to eat. So this is the area. These are you can see what the pyramids are. This is the area of the workers' city. And Mark Lehner, who excavated the city, estimates that there were 2 kinds of dwellings. He found many interesting, well, I'll say it in a minute. He estimates that there were about 4,000 professional permanent workers who had to do the professional work, who had to be really artisans and craftsmen who knew how to quarry and how to dress the stones and how to build and so on. And about 15,000 seasonal workers, which were probably those farmers. And this was different in the living condition. The permanent workers had proper houses. The others lived in kind of barracks or camps or temporary camps during this 3 months working period. And then it works out that with this workforce of about between 15,000 and 20,000 workers, a pyramid could be built in 10 years, which is really quite amazing. Now, they found this was done as a proper archaeological dig, and they found, this is the cemetery, where cemetery always has very interesting stuff in it. For instance, they found that the bodies of the people buried there, some of them showed signs that they were killed during the work because they had accidents. Their legs were broken, the back was broken, and so on. But they also found that, for instance, they found a huge bakery. They must have been baking bread for lots of people. They found a lot of fish and mostly cattle bones, cows and sheep and so on. Now, people in Egypt didn't eat much meat, which means that the workers were very, very well fed because they found huge amounts of bones. So they were very, very well fed. They found grain bins, they found copper working, and they found also in the pyramid and in the city, they found graffiti. As I said before, there's no written record of building of the pyramids, but the graffiti is interesting. For instance, one of the graffiti says, which was found inside the Khufu pyramid, "Friends of Khufu's gang." So we learned from this that the workers were organized into working gangs, and they had names. One of the names was Mykerinos Drunken Friends. That was another graffiti that they found. So we know something about the way they were, maybe they were exchanging, working in shifts. We don't really know. The big question, of course, is, we said there was no slavery. We know, absolutely, there was no slavery in Egypt. No slaves. We know that later on, when Egypt became an empire and they started bringing prisoners from their battles in Asia, the prisoners became slaves. But before Egypt became an empire, there are absolutely no slaves in Egypt. So the workers, who were the farmers really, can we call it forced labor? Were they coerced? Did they have to? I mean, was it something that you absolutely had to do? And if you didn't, you were punished? Was it a military-like service that people or young people were supposed to go into the labor force as a duty? And some people say it was also a religious duty, that building a pyramid for the king ensured that you would have a good place in your afterlife. So it was a kind of a religious duty. So whatever we say about it, the only thing we can say for sure, it was not slaves and not our forefathers. You remember that. But before we finish, and we're nearly there, I have to say something, add something. The fact that the pyramids, even now, defy our logic. We don't really understand how they could achieve such huge construction projects 5,000 years ago. It really is beyond conception. We can't understand. So this, of course, especially in the Middle Ages and later on, led to what we call the invention of pyramidology. Now, pyramidology exists today too, and it's a kind of a pseudoscience. It's not a real science. It's a pseudoscientific method that tries to explain the pyramid. And it tries to, well, you know, it starts from creatures from outer space, but it also goes to explain that the pyramids are aligned and set in a special way, and they have a connection to the stars. And actually, it's a kind of a message center from messages from outer space that get to the pyramids. If you want to, you can join the Pyramidological Society. There's an address here in Great Britain, of course, and there's a lot of written. You can just get into the internet and put pyramidology. You'll find amazing, amazing, amazing theories. So this is a bit fancy. It's very typical, by the way, for New Age theories. They're beloved by New Age theories. The pyramids are really fantastic. But there's also what is supposed to be real science, because the pyramids have not been really explored up to the... Nobody really knows what's inside this huge... They're not empty. They're not... They're all full. So, for instance, Russian University lately revealed that in the Great Pyramid, there is an electromagnetic radiation that comes from pockets of energy within a hidden room of the pyramid's base, and there's the picture of this radiation. So where's this hidden room, and how come there's an electromagnetic radiation? The internet is full of announcements. The Great Pyramid is hiding mysterious chambers that could be about to reveal their secrets. There's a Japanese expedition that puts tiny little robots through the cracks in the pyramid and trying to find hidden passages. There's a project for scanning Khufu's pyramid with atmospheric muons. Excuse me, I have no idea what muons are. Maybe some of you know, I don't know what it is, but this was published in Nature magazine, which is a very reliable scientific magazine, in 2017, that there's a project to scan the pyramids, and using internal structure of the pyramid, using the abundant flux of atmospheric muons. I don't understand it, but if you want to, you can follow it. And there is there's a whole library full of books about the mysteries of the pyramids. So if you want to know more about it, Decoding the Pyramids, the truth about Giza, the secret chamber, and whatnot. There's a lot of myth, there's a lot of mystery, and it's an amazing place. I don't know how many of you have been to Egypt. There's no question that you stand in front of a pyramid, and the only word that comes out of your mouth is, wow, how was it done? And who did it? And how? So this is it. Thank you.
Now we leave time for questions. So those...
Wait a minute, I'm trying to put this loudspeaker up so that I can hear what you're saying.
Those of you who would like to ask questions, just raise your hand.
Linda? I don't see all of you, so I see Linda. So.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Galia. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
Question. has the new museum been completed in Cairo? 1, and 2, where was that boat museum that you showed us?
Okay, the new museum will be completed soon. Last time I was in Egypt at the end of February, and they said in the summer it would be completed, but I was told it would be completed in the summer last year also. So we don't know. In a few months, I imagine the building is complete, and half the old museum has already been transferred to, the equipment has already been transferred to the new museum. It's a question of a few months, and I hope Corona will end by then, and I'll be able to go to see it, because it must be amazing. And the boat museum is right next to the Khufu Pyramid, right outside the Khufu Pyramid.
Okay, thanks.
Anyone else? Yeah.
Jill.
Yes. Gil.
No.
Yes, okay.
Okay, have I unmuted myself? Can you hear me?
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
I can see you.
Okay, how did the rumor evolve then that it was slaves and that they were the Jews, the Israelites, that were building the pyramid? How did that come about?
Well, it's a misunderstanding, because the Bible definitely says that our ancestors were slaves in Egypt, but it also definitely says that they built 2 cities, Pitom and Ramses. Now, we know those 2 cities, they exist. One is called Per Atum in Egyptian, which Pitom sounds like it, and Ramses is a secondary capital that King Ramses the Great, who ruled in the 13th century BC, built to help him fight his wars in the north. So we know this city also, it exists. And what the Bible says is our ancestors built these 2 cities in the 13th century BC, and they built it like all buildings were done, all houses were built in Egypt out of mud bricks. There's normal building material in Egypt would be mud brick and not stones. Stones are much harder to build, so they built palaces and temples out of stones, but houses were built out of mud brick. And there's this whole description about how our ancestors worked very hard making those bricks, if you remember. So this is what the Bible says. Now, I think there was an Egyptian writer called Manetton, and he was quoted by Josephus, who took what Manetton said, and he said that Josephus was maybe the first one to make this mistake, to say that our ancestors were the ones who built the pyramids. But historically, it's an impossible, there's a huge gap in time between the times of the pyramids in the 3rd millennium and the time of the city of Ramses and of the Exodus, if it ever happened, in the 13th century BC. So there are nearly 2,000 years difference. So it's not, and I think it's a myth that the Jewish people like to adopt, you know, that we build these huge buildings.
Galia,
yes, hi.
Hello. There are pyramids in Israel. There's one quite south, just south of where I live in Bet Shemesh. Were these built by the Egyptians when they occupied Israel, or were they built locally, or what do you know about them? And were the Jews who built those?
I didn't understand the question. Could you repeat it? I didn't hear very well.
Yes, there is pyramids in Israel. There's one south of Bet Shemesh where I live, and I think one up near Hazor. Who built those? Were they Egyptians when they occupied the land of Israel, or were they local people copying the Egyptians? And were they? Do you know what they were used for?
You mean the pyramids, the pyramid which is near Maresha?
Yes, I think so, yes.
Oh, no, but this was built during the Second Temple period, much later. And
right.
This was probably Egyptian influence, because by then Egyptian architecture was very, very well known. There's also what we call Pharaoh's daughter tomb in Jerusalem, which is an Egyptian style building, even Yad Shalom. is an Egyptian style building, but this is during Second Temple period, during the Hellenistic period in Egypt, where there was a lot of coming and going between Hellenistic Egypt, and there was Egyptian rule during the Ptolemaic period. So there was a lot of cultural influence, but we don't have any pyramid, as far as I know, pyramid-like buildings from very ancient times in Israel. I don't know about it.
That's what I wanted to know. Yeah, there was copying, in other words.
Okay.
Yeah.
Larry?
Hi.
Hi.
Yes, this is Sharon talking.
Hi.
Thank you, first of all, for the lovely lecture and for all the efforts you made for such beautiful English. It's hard. Two questions. One, regarding, you know, our ancient myth of having come from slavery and therefore having a social justice mission in the world. Is it possible that the word slave was mistranslated or should have been indentured workers or workers that didn't have land and only were used for labor? Is that a possibility of what we were in Egypt? And the second question is, do we know anything about the ethnic race of the Egyptians? You look at those sculptures and you can't quite tell what race they are.
Okay.
Is there any DNA about that?
I don't know much about DNA, but first of all, about the word slave. I mean, in the Bible, which this is where we get it from, there are very definite definitions of what a slave is. He has to be indentured, he's not free, he is bought and sold. The Bible is very generous about it, and after 7 years, they have to be set free and so on. Now, in Egypt, this concept didn't exist. People were not owned by other people till much, much, much later. So I don't think there's a misunderstanding of the term slave. I think that by the time the Bible was written, the idea of slavery was very common. Now, the Bible itself makes a distinction, let's say, between what we call forced labor. Let's say the people after the temple was built, that each tribe had to donate workers each month for the country, for the state. So this was kind of forced labor. We called it Angria. That's if you remember, one of the reasons for the division of the state into the Israel and Judah was the fact that people were angry about it, but they were not slaves. This was forced labor by the government, but it was not slavery. So I don't think there's a misconception of the word slaves. Slaves were slaves, and the Bible knew the difference very well, and so did the Egyptians, because when they did have slaves much later, they used the term slaves. So I don't think there's a misunderstanding here. What was the other question? I don't remember.
The other question was about the ethnicity or the race of the ancient Egyptians.
First of all, it's very hard to say, even though we have a lot of mummies and so on, because there's a lot of diversity, ethnic diversity between the north and the south. In the south, people were more Negroid, if I would say, were more African than in the south, which were more related to the Asians. And there's a lot of mixture. It depends on the period. There's a lot of research about it, but actually I don't know much more than that. I know there was a large, very much diversity. We can see the features of many of the kings that had what we call Negroid features. But, and of course, even nowadays, the people of the south, the Nubians, are more African than the people of the south, of the north, who are more related to Asia. But I'm not really, I don't know that much about it.